All of your favourite F1 content creators, including this very handsome man, have been saying that Charles Leclerc has been the second best driver on the grid in 2024, second to only Max Verstappen, who has just won his fourth F1 title on the bounce. So is Charles Leclerc really that good? Using my massive brain, coupled with me wasting hours and hours of my ever-shortening existence on the planet Earth to rewatch the entirety of the 2024 F1 season, I thought that we would test that theory and find out just how many points Charles Leclerc has lost this season. This is the third and final video in this trilogy. I've done it with Lando Norris, I've done it with Max Verstappen, so similarly to those videos, we're going to look at all the incidents that Charles Leclerc has been involved in that have lost him points this season. We'll attribute them to whether they were a Charles Leclerc mistake or a Ferrari mistake, and then at the end of the video, we'll add them together and see just how many points he has lost this season. In terms of comparing to another driver, in the Lando and the Max video, I was comparing the two drivers against each other. Whereas with Leclerc, given that he finished third in the championship and was relatively close to Norris in second, we'll compare just those two drivers against each other and find out if Leclerc could have finished second in the championship. So, kicking things off right back to the Japanese Grand Prix, round 4 of the season, where essentially Charles had a very poor qualifying, in his own words, in comparison to what he believed he could do. This was all essentially down to him having a poor Q1, which meant that he had to use 2 sets of softs in that session. It ended up costing him later down the line in Q3. He ended up qualifying down in P8. It was definitely clear that he could have been further up based on where Carlos Sainz was. Saying that, to be fair, the drive on Sunday from Charles was exemplary, with him going from P8 on the grid up into P4. Other than a quick trip off the track when under pressure from Sergio Perez, he had had an absolutely amazing Sunday, finishing in P4 just behind his teammate Carlos. But with the pace that he showed in the race, I do think that Charles probably could have finished on the podium in front of Carlos Sainz that day. Given that he did just finish outside of the podium places rather than on it, that is a 3-point loss for Charles Leclerc, and that will go down as his mistake based on the qualifying performance. At the Chinese sprint race in a wet qualifying, Charles Leclerc spun off track and hit the wall, damaging his front wing on his first run. This meant that he only had one run left to complete the session. He ended up coming home in P7, which he admitted was not a good qualifying session for him. However, with a great drive in the sprint race itself, Leclerc managed to raise himself from P7 on the grid up into P4, and honestly I do think that that was about the maximum that the Ferraris could have achieved. He obviously finished in front of Carlos Sainz in the end. So I think that that will go down as no points lost in the end. As much as the mistake did cost him in qualifying, I don't think it actually dropped him any points when it came to the sprint race. Moving on to the Canadian Grand Prix now. What a terrible weekend that was for Ferrari. They just seemed to have absolutely no pace. If you looked at Carlos Sainz's race, he was having a miserable time. But on Leclerc's side of the garage, he started the race on Sunday with an engine issue, so essentially couldn't move any further forward than he started. He was basically just way slower on the straights than he needed to be. The overtakes were incredibly difficult to make, so when the first safety car came out in the race, the team decided that they would box Leclerc for dry tyres when the track was still relatively wet, in the hopes that that would give him the offset that he needed to make progress in the race. However, it was the exact opposite that ended up happening. Leclerc did not make any progress forward. He actually made loads of progress backwards before retiring from the race later on. It didn't really look like Leclerc was going to be scoring points at any point in that race. As I mentioned, Ferrari were just having a terrible weekend overall, scoring 0 points in the end of it. So again, I don't think this will go down as lost points per se, because it just didn't look like it was happening anyway. At the Austrian Grand Prix, in a turn 1 incident with Perez and Piastri, Leclerc essentially just got sandwiched in between the two of them, breaking his front wing. The team then had to change his front wing, dropping him 40 seconds off the back of the pack. He recovered to P11 in the race, but it just wasn't quite enough for points. In terms of lost points in that race, it just wasn't his fault at all. There's nothing he could have done about the situation. If you watch it back, you'll just essentially see that he got closed in between the two drivers, so it's not going to go down as lost points for a mistake from Charles. At the British Grand Prix, it's safe to say that Charles Leclerc hadn't had an amazing start to the race. He was running in P7, some way off of his teammate Carlos Sainz in P6. And given that he was so far down in the race, the team decided to gamble him onto the intermediates a lot earlier than the other drivers did to see if they could make up some positions. What ended up happening was the track didn't get any wetter than they thought it was going to. He essentially was just dropping back and dropping back. He ended up burning out the inters before the rain even got hard enough for the inters to be worth being on. And by the time the rest of the drivers jumped onto the intermediates, Leclerc needed a second set of them due to the fact that they were so burnt out. And by the end of the race, he ended up finishing in P14. Had Leclerc had followed the strategy of the rest of the front runners in the race, he could have converted that P7 that he was in to start the race. Then George Russell obviously DNF'd from the race. That would have put him up another position to P6. So overall, losing that P6 down to outside of the points, that loses Leclerc 8 points. As for whether it's the team's fault or his fault, I initially thought that it was the team's fault for pulling him in that early, trying that risky strategy. But if you actually listen to the team radios between Charles and the team, then you'll see that he was the one that made the call to box that early. That puts the blame on him, in my opinion, so that is 8 points lost, and it is Charles Leclerc's fault. At the Mexican Grand Prix, when defending from Lando Norris, Charles Leclerc had a massive snap of oversteer coming out of the final corner, getting on the power slightly too early. He managed to somehow save the car from going straight into the wall, but obviously in doing so, in going off track, he let Lando Norris through. Now, not quite sure if Charles had it in him to keep Lando Norris behind on that day. Obviously, Carlos Sainz, his teammate, came home to win that race. So I think that that mistake, letting Lando through, will put it down as a 3-point loss for Charles Leclerc, dropping from second down to third. And of course, with it being Lando Norris that was the beneficiary of that mistake, he jumps up and gains an extra 3 points in that scenario. In the Brazilian Grand Prix, after the final safety car of that crazy race, Charles had made an amazing restart and was running in P4. However, he made a mistake into turn 4 and it essentially let George Russell through, dropping him from P4 into P5. Had he not made that mistake, I do believe he probably could have been able to keep George Russell behind for the remainder of the race, would have finished in P4 instead of P5, so that is 2 points lost by Charles Leclerc, and those will go down as his fault. At the Las Vegas Grand Prix, Charles Leclerc was pushing really hard early in the race to try and pass George Russell. However, self-admittedly, he was pushing far too hard. He ended up wearing out the tyres completely and dropping back a couple of positions before making a very early pit stop onto the hard tyres. His pace after switching onto the hard tyres and going through those two stints was very good. So had he had been a little bit more cautious in that first stint, I do think that he probably could have finished in front of his teammate Carlos Sainz on that day. I do think that the Mercedes cars, George and Lewis, were a little bit too quick for the Ferraris on that day, so I don't think that second was on. But if Charles had finished on the podium that day, that would have gained him an extra 3 points in the championship. Now, I have seen some discourse online in terms of Charles Leclerc's engine going into the end of the season and Carlos having a fresher engine than Charles and that costing him in terms of straight line speed towards the end of the season. I personally haven't seen any sort of solid data to back that up in terms of how many points he may have lost towards the end of the season based on Ferrari making that decision too late to change the engine. Obviously, we saw him having a 10-place grid penalty at the final race of the year. He then obviously had an absolutely sublime drive in Abu Dhabi to come home in P3, starting P19. But yeah, I don't think that there's any grounds to say that Ferrari lost Charles points towards the end of the season for the engine, but let me know what you guys think in the comments about that one. If you've made it this far in the video, chances are you're enjoying the content, so please consider subscribing to the channel for more going forward. Got loads planned for 2025, so thank you very much. But without further ado, let's jump into how many points Charles Leclerc has lost this season for the final time. Drum roll, please. That's 19 points, which is crazy. That's such a small amount. If you take Charles Leclerc's end of season points total of 356, add on these 19 lost points, then he would have finished the season on 375 points. And if we take Lando Norris into account, then looking at all of these scenarios, he was only actually involved in one, and he gained 3 points from that. So effectively dropping his points total this season from 374 down to 371. So if you look at it on a whole, then Charles Leclerc could have, in theory, finished second in the championship this season, just ahead of Lando Norris. And when you look at the breakdown between Leclerc and Ferrari, I honestly can't believe this, but all 19 points would be deemed as Charles Leclerc's fault and 0 points from Ferrari. Now, obviously, I'm not trying to say that Charles Leclerc has had a bad season here. If anything, only losing 19 points is absolutely sublime. When you compare that to Lando Norris, his figure was something around 33. However, the comments in that video definitely made me think that I might have been a bit too generous to Lando there and it could have been more. In terms of Max Verstappen's points total, he had lost himself 23 points over the course of the season. Again, the comments made me think that I'd maybe been a bit harsh on Max there, so maybe somewhere around where Charles is would be more fair. But in terms of that ballpark, that is a wonderful season from Charles Leclerc. And obviously, if you want to see how I came to those conclusions about Lando and about Max, then click the links in the description to watch those videos. Of course, one thing that definitely is a bit of a caveat with Charles Leclerc here is that he was not fighting for the driver's title at any point, so he didn't have that pressure. You definitely saw that pressure get to Lando Norris a little bit. You definitely saw Max Verstappen defending more aggressively against Lando because they were in a title fight against each other. So Charles not having that pressure probably benefited him this season. But that's not to say that he didn't have any pressure at all, because Ferrari were of course in that constructors battle with McLaren, and you saw how much that meant to Charles on the podium at the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. He looked visibly upset with the fact that Ferrari didn't manage to win the constructors this season. But I think that this season has definitely shown that Charles Leclerc is the real deal. If you look back to the 2022 season when Charles was in that battle with Max Verstappen at the start of the season, in terms of driver's title, he was making a lot of mistakes. In particular, the French Grand Prix, I just remember him binning it into the wall, leading the race. That was a really low point for him. But this season, Charles has really made no massive errors. And Ferrari, who used to be the sort of meme team on the grid, making countless strategy errors, literally being known for making strategy errors, they are now losing 0 points for Charles Leclerc this season. That's such an amazing turnaround. If they can carry that end of season performance through into next year, they'll definitely be in the conversation for Constructors' title for 2025. And if you look at form of drivers, Charles Leclerc is one of the form drivers on the grid, obviously. Up against Lewis Hamilton next year, on form, isn't looking so good right now. You'd expect Charles to outperform Lewis next year. So with an incredibly fast car, if they bring this end of season performance through, and with a very fast driver in Charles Leclerc, are we looking at the 2025 World Drivers' Champion? I think possibly.